Welcome back to the Anti-Meta Meta Club. This week's race C is one of the most exciting races that we've had in a very long time. It's another hour-long race, and it has dynamic weather, which means even though the Group 3 is pretty balanced, there are a few cars that really stand out when it comes to fighting the meta. Let's get into it. The anti-meta car of the week is the VTEC machine itself, the Honda NSX. Worse than the McLaren in pretty much every single category, so is every other car. And so in the right hands with the right plan, you can actually make this car work really well. The reason that I chose this over some of the other cars that might be even better is when it comes to the rain, which is completely random, it does have a distinct edge against FR cars. You'll have to be careful with both the tires and the fuel, so your pit options aren't going to be quite as good as other cars, but like I said, if it comes down to the rain, this car is going to be phenomenal. It's very clear that the McLaren is the meta car, however, it's also clear that the NSX is pretty good. I unfortunately could not set a good time. My game keeps freezing, so after I make this video, I'm going to have to figure that out. I did have a potential of a 0.6, but I was only able to get a 15.9, but as you can see, it's definitely up there when it comes to the top 10. Align yourself with the grass, making sure you don't go onto the grass when you hit the brakes. As soon as you pass the 100 meter board, that's when you're going to hit the brakes. Be very patient braking in a straight line, making sure you downshift steadily, get down to second gear before turning in, and then downshift to first after you've initiated the turn in, making sure you're using as much of this curb as you can. Gently squeeze on the throttle in second gear, and if you do use this outside curb, make sure that your wheels are mostly straight by the time you hit it, or you can slide out really easily. The famous Radeon and Eau Rouge are up next, and I should note right now that you do not need to do anything with the brake balance. 0 is totally fine. Before the 50 meter board on the left is this light. We want to turn in before we get to that. Aiming to put most of our car all the way up onto this curb, we're going to start turning in right before we get to the end of the colored section right here. Aim for the tire marks on the curb, avoiding the high part, and then look for the gaps between the trees. This lowest gap is where you want to aim just right of. Remembering that you only need 2 tires on the curbs at any given time, you want to straight line it as much as possible. Any kind of steering can slow you down, so do as little of it as you possibly can. The last kink that we just passed, you do not need to set yourself on the left. You can just hug it to the right and then align yourself to the left side of the track right here. Look out for the 100 meter board. Once your nose gets all the way past the 100 meter board, that's when you're going to hit the brakes and move up onto the curb. In third gear, after the 50 meter board, start trail braking and turning in, making sure you get as close to these bollards as you can without going directly into them. Once past them, continue steering to the right and get full throttle, changing directions when you get to the end of the curb on the right. Take note here that I've changed directions, but I stayed full throttle. We're only going to lift off the throttle and then add brakes after we've changed directions. We want to hug this part of the curb, and then we're going to add even more steering as we get back on the throttle after that. Once you get all the way past the beginning of the colored curb here on the left, we're going to change directions, again making sure you stay full throttle until the car has fully changed direction. As you approach these green bollards, lift only enough to make sure that you don't hit them, but you get as close as you possibly can and gently get back on the throttle, making sure you use all of this curb but stay off the AstroTurf green on the left. Ignoring the meter boards this time, we're going to look for the beginning of the curb on the left, and right before we get there, we're going to hit the brakes hard. Using the magic ABS, stay full brake and dive all the way into the corner. We want to get into second gear as we get to the first bollard, then downshift to first to rotate it at the end. I actually completely missed both apexes. You can either do one really late apex or a double apex. Either way, you want to stay really close to the inside the whole time. Accelerate in second, tracking all the way out, and then continue curving to the right. Change direction approximately when you get to this red part of the fence, and we're going to try to hit the curb as soon as we get to the next red part of the fence up ahead. Right before you hit the curb, downshift to second, add a little bit of brakes and try to tuck it in. Once again, of course, trying to just barely miss these bollards. We're going to accelerate in third gear though. Continue steering right. Your car's going to want to understeer if you don't add enough steering, and if you go out onto the AstroTurf, it's going to make you slide and you're going to lose a lot of speed. There's a digital flag that helps in the race, but it's not here in time trial, so I like to use this rock that's just past the fence. When we get there, we're going to downshift to fourth, not going full brake, and your goal is to get off the brakes as soon as you possibly can, just barely hitting the curb on the inside here. You don't have to worry about the next apex, you just have to make sure you don't go too far in the exit curbing because it can pull you all the way off the track. Make sure you continue steering, but you're not steering super hard by the time you hit this final curb, because if you're steering a lot when you hit it, you can also slide here, and of course you don't want that. Make your way to the left side of the track, and again we can ignore the meter boards. We're going to brake right before we get underneath this SPA sign. Brake heavy in third gear turning in as soon as you get to the curb on the left, and you're going to keep a lot of brake pressure as you trail brake in. I use second gear, but you don't actually have to, and in fact I had to use a little bit of throttle, as you can see, to keep up my speed, but this line is my preferred line. Staying just right of the center of the track until you get to this sand that you see here on the right. Once again, we're going to change directions before lifting off the throttle, brake just a little bit, and again just try to barely miss the bollards on the inside. Turn in more before getting on the throttle in third gear, and again, you do not want to go past this part of the curb. It will pull you all the way off the track. Move yourself to the left, and the final yellow segment of the wall right before the curb is where I like to hit the brakes. Braking heavy just briefly, we're going to get to second gear and turn in before you get to the curb there on the right. As a note, I have been able to stay in third gear or pop it to second and back up to third and had just as much speed, if not more, so you might want to experiment with that. Like always, if you go on that green AstroTurf, it's going to slow you down or pull you entirely off the track. You do not want that. I like to use these tire marks as a turn-in point, but you're not going to be able to see that if you're following someone close, so take note of where you are in relation to the beginning of the curb on the right. Stay full throttle here, and like I've said with almost every single corner, you want to get as close to that green bollard as you can, and you want to avoid going over the yellow and red curb into the AstroTurf because it will suck you entirely off the track and it will ruin your lap. Make sure you rev this thing out as much as you possibly can. I'm sorry I don't know exactly what it is in kilometers per hour, but you should be testing every single gear at least a little bit whenever you do one of these time trials, just to know exactly how far you can rev it out before you need to shift. I like to stay on the right here and then track out after the kink to line yourself up for this next braking zone. About halfway between the 150 and 100 meter boards, that's when you're going to hit the brakes. You actually want to turn in a little bit earlier than I did, and you can actually keep second gear, though first gear works as well. You'll see that I didn't use as much curb as I possibly could have here, but it wasn't terrible. You can see that I'm adding full throttle just a little bit, and the cone for the entrance to the pits is just to the right of where I'm aimed before I get off the throttle, turn in, dab the brakes just a little bit, and then get onto second gear before getting fully on the throttle again. Of course, avoid the AstroTurf. Alright, Spa is always a really tough track to nail, and so congratulations if you just got it. Like I mentioned briefly, I actually had a 0.6 optimal and I was working on getting it, but I could not get my game to stop freezing. I have a really weird memory issue, so hopefully I'm going to be able to figure that out before I have to stream today, but I digress. As you can see from my Ghost, you can actually carry a lot more speed through there, and in fact, this was more than 1/10 slower than my best first sector. So like I keep saying, you can go a lot faster than this, and that is especially proven by the fact that one of these is, I believe, in the top 5 still. I actually would not be surprised if someone got this into the 14s. There are definitely people deep into the 15s. This is always tricky. You've got to carry a lot of speed into this right-hander, and you've got to keep it really tight on the left-hander without losing that speed. If you can manage to go all the way up on that left-hand curb, you can carry a lot more speed and get on that throttle a lot earlier for this right-hander. I usually like to treat this corner like it's a double apex, but unfortunately I treated it like a 0 apex, and I missed both of them, but you can definitely do better than that. This curb on the right is always really scary. I try to avoid the high part because it can pull you all the way off to the right, but sometimes I don't use quite enough, and I think that time was one of those times. Here I slowed down a little bit too much, and I also lingered on the brakes a little bit too much. I also came off too quickly, so if you can really smoothly use a little bit less brake than that, you'll be able to get on the throttle even earlier than I did. Like I mentioned in the breakdown, I didn't need to use second gear here. I could have stayed in third and hit the same line, and in fact I had to use maintenance throttle to make sure I didn't lose too much momentum there. If you are feeling really confident in your braking, you can try using just third gear here instead of dipping it down into second gear. I ended up going a lot faster in subsequent laps before my game started freezing over and over again. So I definitely think there's a lot of time to be found on just that one corner, and it's a very especially important one considering it leads to the longest straight, or kind of straight. Make sure you set yourself up all the way on the right so you don't have to turn much here, and you don't need to hit that curb on the inside. Hitting that curb can actually send you spinning. I think I braked to the right point here, but I turned in too late and I went down to first gear. If you turn in earlier, you can put just your left tires on the red and yellow part of that curb, and you'll be able to carry a lot more speed and get on the throttle earlier for the left-hander, the final left-hander. So this is one of those wild dynamic races, and before we go over the details or any of the breakdowns of the races themselves, we're going to talk about exactly what you need to do as soon as you get into the lobby, and that is check the weather radar. I've done probably 8 of these races now, and only 2 of them had any kind of rain. What you want to do is look at this weather radar. As you can see, that blue mass that's moving in, that is potential rain. If it's just that light blue color, however, it's probably not going to rain even if it's a big chunk. You're going to see later on in this race that it didn't rain whatsoever, despite the fact that it definitely did go over the track. If you look at the bar at the top, it shows -60, -30 in current time. You can use the miles in the radar to determine exactly how fast it's going to move within the 60 and 30 minute time frames. And of course, you're going to want to pay attention to how much it can move within 30 minutes. A lot of times you can actually guess how long it's going to take to get to you. If you see how many miles it moves within that 60 to 30 minute time frame, then you can estimate exactly when it's going to hit you. Now, in this race, there was no rain, like I just said, but in another race that I'm going to show you, there was a lot of rain and I accidentally didn't check beforehand. We'll come back to that though. The strategy for the dry race is a lot more simple than any of the wet races, as you can imagine, considering it's completely random. Unfortunately, the McLaren is so good in every single aspect that there are very few cars that are better than it in any single aspect, and there are no cars that are better in it than even any two aspects. The car handles incredibly well. It's incredibly fast in the straights. It accelerates well. It saves fuel better than almost every other car, and it saves tires better than almost every other car. It is one of the most dominant cars that we've had in any of the Bapes that we've seen. So with that, it means that we really have to use our driving abilities rather than our strategy, but that doesn't mean that there's no strategy available. It's a 20-lap race with a required pit stop, so that makes changing tires a no-brainer. If it didn't have a required pit stop, that would make a completely different set of cars better. But since you have to take a pit stop, the cost of changing tires is not that much. If you've been watching my guides, then you know a lot of the time we use strategy rather than just pace to get past our opponents, but it's not as easy this time around to come up with a different strategy. Most people are going to be on a very similar strategy. We'll talk more about that in a little bit, but I do want to show you that this car does have what it takes to bring it to the McLaren wheel to wheel. I felt bad for this Adler guy. I gave him a lot of space, but I don't think he knew I was going to, so he drove himself all the way out. There was actually no contact between us, and of course he went past where he should, and that pulled him all the way off the track. Sorry, buddy. Now, as you drive this car, there are two things that you're going to notice about halfway through the race. One, your tire wear is going to be pretty bad, and two, you're not going to have a lot of fuel, so you're going to spend some extra time refueling unless you can spend time behind these guys saving fuel. I wouldn't suggest trying to use the fuel maps. It's pretty tough, especially on this track, and it's not very efficient. If you're going to do anything, you want to short shift, but of course, this is a VTEC kind of car, and that means all of the power is really high in the rev range, so honestly, it's probably not worth trying to save fuel. Now, you might find yourself around lap 9 or 10 feeling that the tires possibly are a little bit too worn, but not to worry. Since the very first stint, you're going to have more fuel than pretty much the entirety of the second stint, it's going to be a lot worse. And at the beginning, you're probably going to have incidents like you just saw. You're going to have dirty air, and that is going to cause the tires to wear a little bit more. Your second stint should be a lot easier. So if you do want to go for an undercut, pitting on lap 9 instead of lap 10 or even lap 8, it should be totally fine as long as you're careful. Behind us is an RCZ, which is pretty similar, but it doesn't have as good top speed, I don't believe. The Porsche in front of us accelerates really well, but it also doesn't have quite as good top speed. This car doesn't have great top speed either, but it is better than the Porsche, and it's better than the BRZ, which I initially considered for an anti-meta car. The Porsche has really good brakes, but so does this car. I think this car does have superior turn-in, however, so if you do find yourself making an inside pass, you're not going to lose a lot of time because you're going to be able to get the car to rotate really quickly on these little corners. There's probably going to be a lot of chaos, as you can see here, and if you are going for passes, you're going to need that nimbleness, which this car does provide. Jack, if you're watching, I'm sorry if I cut off your nose there. I did not realize that I was that close to you. The 4C was another car that I had considered, and it has much better tire wear. However, it doesn't quite have the acceleration that this car does. You're going to see that it is just as nimble, though. It may be just a short run, but you can see by the delta on the left that we're catching up pretty quickly, despite the fact that he also has slipstream. Also of note with this car, it has really good turn-in even when you're in that dirty air, which is very important in this game because we know that dirty air is pretty crazy in this game. I was really lucky to find so many people who are willing to drive really cleanly, and so I really appreciate the fact that this guy actually gave me space on the exit here. I, of course, would much rather take a position very cleanly, so I'm going to give him space as well, even if it compromises the exit to one of the most important corners, but I was able to take the outside line there, which was faster, and because of this car's superior acceleration, I was able to get all the way in front of him, and yeah, that was just a really good race with that guy. I really enjoyed the couple corners with him. Like I mentioned in the breakdown, minimizing your steering up Radeon, or is that Eau Rouge? Either way, up the hill. Minimizing your steering is really, really important. So if you can steer less than the guy in front of you, then you're going to be able to carry more speed. And it's also really important to note that this car does have enough power that when you're in the slipstream, you can actually move closer and closer to even a McLaren that is also in the slipstream. I've spent a lot of time driving the McLaren, and it does not have terrible performance in dirty air, but it's not great. I would say that this is superior to it. That might be the only way that this car is superior than the McLaren. It does feel a lot better in dirty air than the McLaren does, and I've spent a lot of time with the McLaren. I actually just recently won the exhibition season for my region in the top split. I got 8th place overall. It's just an exhibition season, unfortunately, but I'm just saying I've spent a lot of time in the McLaren, and this feels a lot more comfortable driving really close than the McLaren does. So just one thing of many that this thing is actually better than the McLaren in. I ended up making quite a few more moves, but none of them are really that much different than what I've already shown you. And more importantly, there's one thing that I wanted to talk about that I actually forgot to mention so far. If you look up at the track map, you'll notice that the wind is moving at 6.5 feet per second, and it's nearly going south. However, that is pretty close to what you see in time trial conditions, but it can actually go the opposite direction. It can go any direction. So unlike the time trial conditions, the actual race wind will be different from race to race, and that can drastically change when you need to brake and when you need to turn in, all that kind of stuff. So be very, very careful paying attention to that, and make sure you take note of that before you start any of these races. As you can see, I've used about 50% of the tires. That will go down much more, so don't try to run just one set of tires out all the way to 0. You will have a very bad time. If you look at the little diamond that is sitting above where it says that I have 39% of the gas tank left, that is what it thinks you'll need based on what you've used so far. And you can trust that as long as you've been, one, revving it out, or you've been paying attention to exactly how much you've been revving it out. If you've been short shifting and you fill up to the diamond, you're going to have to short shift the exact same amount in order to make sure you have enough fuel. So that's another reason why it's really tricky to save fuel in this race. If you are following behind cars and using different fuel maps, then you won't really be able to rely on that. And instead, you're going to have to figure out exactly how much fuel you can use when going full out, or you'll have to replicate exactly what you did to save fuel, which can be really tough. Now, as you probably saw, I moved my brake balance a little bit to the front. That can make it so that you use a little bit less of the rear tires when braking, but it's nowhere near as drastic as it was in GT Sport. In this game, it's a lot less about how you brake and more about how much you're sliding, how much steering angle you use, but it's not nothing. So feel free to move the brake balance a little bit to the front to try to save the rears a little bit more. If you remember, at the end of the 9th lap, we had a little bit less than 50% of our left rear tire and about 50% of our right rear tire left. And now looking at the beginning of lap 19, so essentially twice the distance, you'll see that we have just a little bit more of each. Like I said before, your first stint is going to be heavier on the usage because of fuel and other factors. So even if you had pretty terrible wear at the end of your first stint, you don't have to worry about your second stint being quite as scary. I also did make a few mistakes and definitely did not optimize my laps, which definitely caused me a lot more tire usage. So, like I said, your second stint shouldn't be nearly as scary. In what was only my second time racing this car, I was able to go from 16th to 2nd place. Like I mentioned before, the wind conditions do play a part in your lap times, but I've seen multiple people hit 16.2s with this car, so there's a lot more pace, both in the time trial as well as the race when it comes to this car. And with that said, let's take a look at a rainy race. As I showed you in that previous race, there is a way to check the weather radar and see exactly what may happen during the race, but I actually forgot to do that, which is a terrible idea, obviously. It's very, very important that you check that weather radar, which is actually a newish feature before you start the race. In previous times that we've had dynamic weather, the only thing you could do was jump out during the warm-up and see what the conditions are, look at the weather radar then, and just make your best guess on what you should do. And sometimes that resulted in you needing to put on intermediate tires or wet tires, and it ended up just being a big guess. So if you could guess better than other people, then you'd have the advantage. As you may have seen from that weather radar, there is a giant bar of weather, of potential rain coming through, and it's not that light stuff. There were some dark blue spots coming in. So that means we've got to pay attention to it and essentially pit at the exact right time. Like I mentioned previously, if it's just that really light blue color, it's probably not going to rain at all. But if there's any dark blue, then that means as soon as the light blue hits, there's going to be a lot of rain. So as you can see, rain is now touching the track, and it is officially the time to go into the pits. The meter to the left of the tire meter is the surface water meter, and sometimes that does not start filling up before you can actually see raindrops. Also, the hazard lights that are on the center of the back of the cars will start flashing, and if you look at the outside view of your car, you can actually see the windshield wipers start turning on as soon as it starts getting wet. Now, as you can see from my fuel, it looks like I have to fill it all the way up just to make it. And luckily, even if this were a dry race, I would be able to make it, but it would also show it if it was full if I couldn't possibly make it with the current amount of fuel usage by filling it up. If we're using this car and we have to pit on lap 2 or 3 for wet tires or intermediate tires, then we'd be in trouble if it dried out. However, you also have to take into note the fact that when you're in the rain, you're going to use a lot less fuel. So even if it seems like you won't make it, you can make it pretty far, probably 5 or 6 laps longer than it says you could if you're going to be racing in the rain. Now, if you get to the point where that track surface water meter is in the top third, then that means that you should use the wets most likely. MR cars, however, can get away with using the intermediate tires even a little bit into that top tier. The chances of it being a full wet lap or full wet tire race are extremely slim though. You can see from the weather radar that it's the medium color blue. If it's all dark blue, you probably will need the wets. And if you're in an FR car rather than one of the MR cars, you're most definitely going to need the wet tires rather than the intermediate tires. If it's just on the cusp, if it's just barely into the top third, then intermediates are probably just going to be fine. And if it's going to dry out at all, you definitely want the intermediates. Now, this is kind of a deep secret that wasn't really known about, or at least it wasn't talked about. It wasn't shared with me at the very least until earlier today. Since this is a competitive game, there's actually a lot of gatekeeping that happens in the competitive community. So I don't know how long this has been known, but in real life, on the normal racing line, there's a lot of rubber that is put into the track, and that rubber stays there. And when it gets wet, the rubberized part of the track is actually more slippery. You may have noticed as I braked into turn 1 that I was in the center of the track. If you are braking on the normal racing line and it is a fully wet race like this, you're actually going to take a lot longer to slow down and you can really easily slide out. So as you'll be able to see by how much I'm catching the McLaren, of course it probably has a lot to do with my confidence in driving in the wet too, I'm able to brake a lot later than those guys and slow down a lot more efficiently by staying off the racing line. Now that is a really difficult thing to do because every single corner is going to have to be taken completely different than you've ever taken it before unless you've done this a lot. Not only is braking affected, but of course, when you get on the throttle, if you're on that slippery line, then it's going to be a different story too. So you're going to have to experiment and play around with a lot of different lines when it comes to a fully wet race like this. Curbs are pretty slippery too, but they're not quite as slippery as if you're in drying conditions on the slicks and you go up on them. You can still use the curbs just a little bit. When a drying line appears, that drying line is going to have the most grip, but sometimes it's still slippery when it looks like it's drying. So this right here actually completely proved what we had just learned. I braked just about where you're going to see I brake on the next lap, but since it was still wet, I missed my apex by a lot. Here we are on the very next lap. You can see there is a distinct drying line, and I'm going to brake approximately the same place that I braked on the last lap when I slid way past the apex, and I had grip. Like I said before, when there is a drying line like this, you've got to make sure that you just stay on that drying line as much as you possibly can. And if you dip 2 tires outside of it, the difference in grip that the tires in the drying line and outside of the drying line have will be dramatic enough that it can spin you. So be very careful with that. As a final note, I want to talk a little bit about general rain driving strategies. Everything in the wet is going to take longer. Every single thing, from braking to turning to getting on the throttle, it's going to take a lot longer, so you need to give yourself a lot more time. You've got to brake earlier, you've got to turn in earlier, and you've got to get on the throttle a lot more gentle. As you can see from all the steering corrections that I'm making mid-corner, you're going to experience oversteer. You pretty much can't get around it. You're going to experience a lot of understeer as well, but when you get on that throttle, your car is going to want to try to slide around. The rear end of your car is going to try to get in front of the front end of your car, and you just have to make sure that that doesn't happen. These cars can slide and they can drift, but unlike a regular car that you might actually be trying to drift, these cars can't hold a really steep angle. As long as you hold a really minimum angle, you can actually hold a drift around most of these corners, but it's really sketchy. Your best bet, and the faster thing to do, of course, is to just neutralize any kind of oversteer as soon as you possibly can. Whatever you do, if you start sliding out, don't panic and lift off the throttle all the way. Don't jam on the throttle, and don't hit the brakes. That'll exacerbate everything. You can add throttle gently to get more weight over the rear tires if you do start experiencing some slow oversteer, but this all comes with experience. So take this week to use as much time as you can to learn how to race in the rain. A final weird thought that I have that has really helped me out a lot, and I think it's helped some people out that I've tried to teach how to drive in the rain, is instead of giving your car commands, you're making requests of every little thing. Every time you touch the brakes, every time you steer, every time you touch the throttle, it's a request, not a command. And if you treat it like that, the car is going to behave a lot better than if you try to command it and demand more out of it. I'm hoping for a lot more rainy races. I really love the rain. I live in Oregon where it rains 9 months out of the year, and when I attended GT Academy in 2014, the only race that I won was a fully wet race at the Ascari track, the Ascari resort, and I won by 9 seconds. So I always feel like I have to defend my honor when it comes to rain races. If you have any questions, especially about driving in the rain, then please ask me in the comments, and I hope this helps. Thank you as always for watching my video. If you like what you saw, please don't forget to like and subscribe. And of course, I will be streaming later today at 1 p.m. Pacific time. I'll see you there.